Japanese-American Internment by Cosmo and Pavel Weisberg.
Japanese-American internment was the forced relocation and internment by the United States government in 1942 of approximately 110,000 Japanese Americans and Japanese residing along the Pacific coast of the United States to camps called war relocation camps in the wake of Imperial Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces assaulted the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor in what was to become one of the most devastating surprise attacks on U.S. soil. The Japanese were now America's #1 enemy, and a general feeling of distrust emerged between the Americans and the Japanese.
Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt was head of the Western Command and who administered the internment program, did not trust the Japanese citizens. He said to newspapers repeatedly, "A Jap's a Jap," and testified to Congress, "I don't want any of them here. They are a dangerous element. There is no way to determine their loyalty. It makes no difference whether he is an American citizen, he is still Japanese. American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty, but we must worry about the Japanese all the time until he is wiped off the map."
On February 19, 1942, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed military commanders to designate zones to hold Japanese Americans captive. Anyone with as little as 1/16 Japanese blood could be placed in these internment camps. This was one of FDR's most controversial moves, and removes him from the running from being one of the greatest presidents of all time.
A Japanese American unfurled his banner the day after the Pearl Harbor attack. This Dorothea Lane photograph was taken in March 1942, just prior to the man's internment.
Many Americans felt hatred towards the Japanese due to the propaganda that they were exposed to. The internment camps only increased their feelings of racism and xenophobia.
In the internment camps, the Japanese had simple frame housing without plumbing or cooking facilities of any kind. Camps were built quickly by contractors during the summer of 1942, designed like military barracks, which made the buildings poorly equipped for crammed family living.
Since most Japanese were evacuated on short notice, they couldn't take many of their belongings. Many failed to pack appropriate clothing for the conditions, which in some camps meant below zero winters. Camps were surrounded by barbed wire, and they had unpartitioned toilets, cots for beds, and a budget of 45 cents daily per capita for food rations.
Armed guards were posted at the camps, which were all in remote, desolate areas far from population centers. Internees were typically allowed to stay with their families and were treated well unless they violated the rules. There are documented instances of guards shooting internees who reportedly attempted to walk outside the fences. Nearly a quarter of the internees left the camps to live and work elsewhere in the United States. Some camp administrations eventually allowed relatively free movement outside the marked boundaries of the camps. Eventually, some were authorized to return to their hometowns in the exclusion zone under the supervision of sponsoring American families or agencies whose loyalty had been assured.
In December 1944, a Supreme Court order ruled Japanese internment unconstitutional, and on June 5, 1945, internees began to leave the camps to rebuild their lives. The freed internees were given $25 and a train ticket back to their former homes. Many internees lost irreplaceable personal property due to the restrictions on what could be taken into the camps. These losses were increased by theft and destruction of items placed in governmental storage. A number of persons died or suffered for lack of medical care, and several were killed by sentries near the perimeter wire. Psychological injury was also observed, and many Japanese were very depressed and felt helpless in the face of Americans. Some Japanese American farmers were able to find families willing to take care of their farms while they were gone, but many had to sell their farms for very low prices at great losses to themselves, and many just lost their farms.
Beginning in the 1960s, A younger generation of Japanese Americans who were inspired by the civil rights movement began what is known as the Red Dress Movement, which was an effort to obtain an official apology and reparations from the federal government. The campaign for Red Dress was launched by Japanese Americans in 1978. The JACL, or the Japanese American Citizens League, asked for 3 measures to be taken as Red Dress. 1. $25,000 to be awarded to each person who was detained. 2. An apology from Congress acknowledging publicly that the U.S. government had been wrong. And 3. The release of funds to set up an educational foundation for the children of Japanese American families. Finally, in 1988, U.S. President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which provided redress of $20,000 for each surviving detainee, totaling up to $1.2 billion.